Stocks at session lows now. This after we got word that Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin has officially decided with Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo that he will not attend the Saudi Arabia Future Investment Initiative due to take place next week. We've been waiting until just now, in fact, to see whether the Treasury Secretary would change his mind. He was one of the holdouts. He was going until just a few moments ago it was announced that he wasn't. Shortly after, it must be said, a news conference given by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo following his trip to Saudi Arabia, during which he said we need to give Saudi Arabia a couple of days in order to figure out what exactly happened to Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist, who went into the Saudi Arabia consulate in Turkey and never came out. So let's bring in Bloomberg's Nick Wadham in Washington, D.C. Now, Nick, it's interesting to see the market react to this. Clearly, the market had expected that the Treasury Secretary would go to Saudi Arabia and there would be some way of sweeping this under a rug somewhere. It's not going away, is it?
No, I mean, evidence just continues to mount that the Saudi government may have been involved in some way in Jamal Khashoggi's death. I mean, what you're seeing, though, essentially is a cost-free way for the United States to express some disappointment or concern with Saudi officials. Also, it would have looked pretty ridiculous for Steve Mnuchin to go ahead and attend this event because so many officials, so many senior officials from both business and government have now pulled out. Christine Lagarde, the trade and finance ministers from France, the UK, media figures, and Jamie Dimon, for example. So he would have been one of the very few senior people to go. Also, you know, the administration was stung a little bit by Secretary Pompeo's visit to Saudi Arabia. Some pretty bad optics there when he visited the Crown Prince and the King. He was shown smiling and shaking hands with a big grin on his face. So this may be less an action that demonstrates Saudi Arabia will face severe consequences and more an awareness of the optics of looking too chummy with the Saudi regime at this point.
Right. So then the next question to ask is exactly that. I mean, can Saudi Arabia get away with no consequences whatsoever, given that the US is a little bit dependent on Saudi for, you know, a sort of a united front against Iran when the US imposes sanctions on November 4th? And given that we already heard just today from the Secretary of State saying we need to keep in mind that Saudi is a strategic ally.
That's right. I mean, that was the key message for me out of Secretary Pompeo's speech. He said he wants to give Saudi Arabia a few more days to produce the results of an investigation into Khashoggi's death or disappearance. But he also underscored this is a relationship that goes back decades. The U.S. Sells billions of dollars in weapons to Saudi Arabia, and it's also made Saudi Arabia central to its plans for the Middle East. So the signaling out of the administration right now is that this is too important a relationship to throw away. In this case, particularly when the U.S. says it doesn't have all the facts. However, you know, something like this is a symbolically charged way of showing that the U.S. is going to take a slightly harder or more independent stance, is not going to just be totally cozy with the Saudis, but without actually having to do anything that would impact that relationship more broadly.
Nick, walk me through the implications of Mr. Mnuchin's decision not to go to Saudi Arabia through the prism of the midterms. We are in sort of pitch battle politically in the United States at the moment. This story is featuring centrally in the media at the moment. How do those two things interact?
Well, I mean, I think, as you say, what's happening here is this is a story that refuses to go away. Part of that appears to be a conscious effort by the government of Turkey to keep it in the spotlight and continue to have information come out in Turkish state media that provides increasingly gruesome details about what appears to have happened to Jamal Khashoggi. So there may be an orchestrated element to this staying in the spotlight, but nevertheless, it's becoming something where the administration's stance and President Trump's refusal to threaten severe consequences against Saudi Arabia or really issue any sort of condemnatory language at all is looking increasingly out of step with the facts on the ground. And you also have that from Congress getting increasingly tough and threatening sanctions.